Hey guys, how you doing? Welcome to Wellness Wednesdays. This is Dr. Mike Ronsisvalle. Super glad you're with me for another moment where we can just take a second, press pause on our week right in the middle and try to get some strategies and information that help us get healthy and stay healthy and ultimately live well, right? That's what we all want to do. That's why we're doing this. So thanks for being here. Last time we were able to really get into the idea of narcissism and how to deal with narcissists. We kind of started that process. And so I hope that you were able to tune in for that first piece on narcissism. If you weren't, if you go to our YouTube channel, you will be able to watch that first piece on narcissism. So I'd highly encourage you to do that because we go over the symptoms of narcissism and the idea that narcissism is ultimately a continuum, right? Not everybody has narcissistic personality disorder. As a matter of fact, very, very few people have narcissistic personality disorder. A lot of us have narcissistic traits and tendencies. It's part of being human, right? And there's moments where we're all self-centered, right? So you can't get kind of pulled into this idea that, well, he's a narcissist or she's a narcissist, because you want to be careful there. A lot of people, they feel like that means you've got narcissistic personality disorder, and it's just not the case. So we were able to tackle that last time. I really want you to go back and listen to that, watch that, because that'll give you context for what we're going to talk about today. Then we got into the idea of what it's like to work with someone who has narcissism and what are the strategies there and what's it like to be married to a narcissist. It sucks. I can tell you that. I've heard so many stories. To be married to a narcissist can be very difficult. So we gave you some information there. And today we're going to pick up on what it's like to be raised by a narcissist. That's tough, man. So there are some of you that you're watching this today because you were raised in a family where your mom or your dad were a full-blown narcissist, and you know exactly what it's like to try to deal with that and to try to grow up under that kind of pressure. So, man, this is probably 5 Wellness Wednesdays that we could talk about just how that impacts you as a kid and how it impacts your core beliefs as an adult. And so remember this as we're having this conversation about what it's like to grow up in a narcissistic family, with a narcissistic family. The strategies you learn as a little kid, as a young adult, literally form your core belief. It forms the way you see yourself in this world. The ideas you have about what makes you acceptable and worthwhile and significant and valuable and lovable. It teaches you how to stay connected to other humans. And I know people respond to this sometimes negatively, like, nah, what happened to me as a kid doesn't matter. That's the past. I want to move forward. Totally get it. With you. I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist. I like to look forward. I like to look at the present. But man, we can't ignore the impact that growing up in a family like this has. So remember, your brain is developing. When you're 5 years old, you literally have almost zero frontal lobe activity going on. When you're 13, you might have less frontal lobe activity going on. Frontal lobe is judgment and reasoning. It's just not online yet. It's when you're forming those core neural pathways that kind of inform how you see yourself. And if you think about how powerful that can be, growing up in a family where it's all about your parent, it's all about what they need, it's all about meeting their needs for admiration, their needs to be right. Some of you grew up in a family where your mom or your dad or both of them, they had to be right. It had to be their way or the highway every time. What does that do to an 8-year-old? What does that teach you about how to maintain connectedness? Some pretty toxic things, right? And kids that grow up in those environments learn that, man, you better work very hard to size up situations, understand what situations require, create relevant responses, and get desired outcomes. Like, that's what you do. And the reason I'm looking around is because that's what these kids do. It's like they're always looking, like, what's going to happen next? And you learn to be ultimately really controlling. It's going to be hard for some of you to hear. But you learned, man, if I don't control outcomes, I'm at risk. And maybe I'm not at risk physically, but I'm certainly at risk emotionally. Certainly at risk to kind of get love taken away or withdrawn from me. I'm certainly at risk to be rejected. And you take that core belief, that way of seeing the world, that lens, and you bring it into relationships in high school. You bring it into relationships with boyfriends and girlfriends in college. You brought it to your marriage. You brought that training to your marriage. And there's moments where your spouse has been like, what's going on? Why are you trying to control every aspect of my life? And you probably in that moment didn't have the insight that you have that tendency to want to control, because if you don't control, based on your experience, some pretty significant things can happen. Some pretty negative things can happen. Rejection, lack of love, withdrawal of love, the withdrawal of approval, conditional love. All those things are what happens to kids that grow up with parents that have this deep, unhealthy, toxic need to make everything about themselves. All right. How does this play out in the life of a family? Like I said, this is 5 Wellness Wednesdays, so I'm going to hit the high points so we can make sure we get through some of this today. One of the things that came up for me was just the idea of parental favoritism and excessive criticism. Those two pieces, those two dynamics define a narcissistic family. And some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. Some of you are so familiar with that dynamic where, man, you're at odds with your siblings. It wasn't, oh, this is my brother, my sister, I love them. It wasn't that at all. You guys were played against each other. And if one of you was willing to give the narcissistic parent affirmation, agreement, if you were going to people please them and just give them what they needed in that moment, you were going to be the favored kid. And if one of your siblings was just not in a good mood or didn't have the emotional wherewithal to play by the family rules, and they bucked the narcissistic parent, man, they were demonized, right? There's a lot of black and white thinking in narcissistic families. I love you. I hate you. Come here, go away. Does that sound familiar? If you say and do what I want you to say, you're awesome. And what a beautiful, all the love bombing. What a great kid. If you don't say or do what I think you should say or do, you piece of crap. What is wrong with you? I have a buddy that, man, he told me a story one time, and I've never forgotten it. He said, Mike, my dad used to look at me with this look. And the way he looked at me was like, Dave, you're an idiot. Dave, my buddy, had this look on his face when he said it. I felt uncomfortable. I was like, Dave, is that how your dad would look at you? He's like, man, every time I did something that wasn't in line with his thoughts, his ideas. And he said, I made a decision a long time ago. I never want to look at my kids like that. It impacted him so much that he had spent hours, days, weeks, months, years, decades probably, and his main goal with his boys was to never look at them with that disapproving, negative, critical facial expression. Isn't that crazy? One look. He said, Mike, my dad never said a critical word. Isn't that wild? His dad wasn't like verbally critical, but the way he looked just created such shame in his life. So we've got parental favoritism. You were played against each other with your siblings, and then excessive criticism. Like never enough, never enough, never enough. Another thing that kind of just defines this process is emotional neglect, is what I call it, or emotional manipulation. So remember we were talking earlier about come here, go away. I love you. I hate you. Categorical thinking, black and white thinking. That creates this process, this dynamic in a family where a kid starts to feel like if I'm not towing the party line, if I don't believe what the family believes, if I don't play by the family rules, then I'm going to be manipulated. It's going to be used against me. I might deal with like physical altercation, a lot of spanking, a lot of corporal punishment. And if it wasn't this clear sort of aggression, then it was neglect, emotional neglect. And man, what's worse? I mean, sometimes I think just kids would feel like, just hit me. Just literally, I'd rather you hit me than feel like I'm nothing and to feel so rejected by you. And there are people that are watching this today. You know exactly what I'm talking about. You have that deep, deep fear of rejection, that deep fear of the loss of love. And that can be devastating for someone in a marriage, in a relationship with a close friend, in a business relationship. If you're struggling with some of those emotions where you over worry about rejection, or you proactively try to reject other people with your anger or snarkiness or whatever because you're afraid of them rejecting you, that's because you grew up in a narcissistic family. It's highly likely. And then the last piece that happens, and it's super sad actually, is shame. The end result of all of this with kids, these little brains that can't make sense of it and they don't understand why my parent is treating me like this and I just don't get it, is you leave your house ultimately with this deep sense that you're just not enough. And that shame keeps you from authenticity. It keeps you from allowing yourself to be vulnerable with others, and it keeps you lonely. The most important thing that people that struggle with shame want to do is hide. You want to hide. I don't want anyone to see my weakness. I don't want anyone to criticize me. I don't want anyone to know how I really feel, because it's just a matter of time. If you see me, that you'll reject me. And it's out of that shame that a lot of times in a marriage, in a relationship as an adult, man, you can have chaos that builds. That shame just births chaos because it's impossible for anyone to kind of come to you with a problem, an issue, anything, because it starts to trigger that sense of, I'm not enough. And before you know it, you're reacting. You're either going to please and over please and ingratiate yourself and be what they need you to be and work harder than anybody else in the relationship to make sure everything's okay. Or, man, you're just going to be angry. And that aggression is like, I will reject you before you have a chance to reject me. So what does that do? How does that impact people? I think ultimately it comes down to boundaries. I think if you grow up in a narcissistic family, you struggle with boundary setting. Sometimes they're too rigid, sometimes they're too loose, and you just don't know where to draw that line. So my encouragement to you is if you're hearing this and it's triggering some epiphanies like, man, that's kind of how I work, that's how I operate, man, don't let that go. Talk to somebody about it. Talk to your spouse about it. Talk to a friend about it. You just can't sit in this without recognizing my past is impacting my present, and it's going to define my future if I don't allow myself to just be open and honest. And shockingly, the solution to this is vulnerability. I know that sounds crazy, but the more you can get with someone who's trusted and just have vulnerable conversations where you start talking about it with an adult brain, you will be able to make sense of it, and you'll start to have more control over how you respond to situations in the moment, because you'll have the insight, right? Insight can lead to action, and that's what we would want. So you have this insight about how your family has impacted you and how the narcissism has played out. Now you have some real motivation to change the way you interact right here, right now. What do those boundaries need to look like? Ultimately, if you're still interacting with your family member that's a narcissist, there's going to be moments where you need to limit the emotional exposure that you have to them. So you grew up with a narcissistic mom. You might be at a point where you're like, look, she's still operating in her narcissism. She hasn't changed a lot. And part of what I'm going to do is just limit the amount of emotional kind of energy I give that relationship. And that's okay. You can't beat yourself up for that. It's not appropriate for you to just continue to put yourself in positions where, that narcissistic parent is just berating you. All the criticism is going on and you're never enough, and you have to do things and navigate it exactly right and believe exactly the way they believe, or else you deal with their wrath. That's just no way for an adult to live, right? So you can still be present with someone, but just not go to emotional places, right? So go to dinner, treat it with respect and honor. I get that, right? They're your parents. Everybody has issues. And if they're a narcissist, they definitely has them. But that doesn't mean that you have to just completely emotionally cut them off or physically cut them off. Go to dinner, talk about, benign things, great movies, whatever. Let them see your kids. Hang out in measured ways, right? In protective ways. But you just want to limit how much emotion you actually invest in the relationship. That's boundary number one. Boundary number two is a little tougher, because there's some people that we know from this talk that have narcissistic traits or tendencies. There's others that are just so sick, right? And they're probably full-blown narcissist. And if they're not getting help, and you're just in a situation where it's toxic and unhealthy, and you feel like it's just not gotten better for years, there might be a moment where you have to have a pretty strong physical boundary. And there's really two physical boundaries. There's low contact and no contact. Right? Low contact is we show up for Christmas, we do Thanksgiving, we do some things because we want to honor our parents and the larger family, and do whatever for our kids, and we don't want to, it's not worth sort of the no contact. But we're going to have low contact. I'm going to minimize my exposure. And some of you need to free yourself up to minimize your exposure, low contact. Some of you, it's been so toxic, so negative. It's impacted everything. It's impacted your marriage. It's impacted your kids. Your mom or dad, who's a narcissist, have been so just incredibly aggressive. You need to have no contact. You need to let yourself do that without shame. Now, can you put some conditions out there? Yeah, tell them, hey, go get therapy for a couple years, and when you're getting healthier, call me. We can and we can revisit this. But for now, I can't expose myself or my family to this any longer. And there's lots of reasons why people do no contact. One of them would be that you're just so toxic. I don't feel comfortable exposing myself or my family to it any longer. Like I said, 5 Wellness Wednesdays. Like the whole idea of no contact and all that it brings. That's something we could talk about over and over and over again. But for now, let's just leave it as that's a healthy option at certain points, depending on the situation. Okay, so how do we manage and protect ourselves in narcissistic relationships? If we have relationships with people that have these traits and the self-centeredness is there and it's just overwhelming and causing problems, let me give you some strategies that you can just across the board, whether it's an office worker or a romantic relationship or a family member, whatever. Number one, set boundaries early and clearly. Set boundaries early and clearly. One of the problems that most of us have with boundaries is we wait too long. And when you wait too long, you're basically training the other people in your life that they can treat you a certain way. So you're responsible for that, right? Like, you're responsible for how you let other people treat you. And remember, boundaries, they're not requests. If you draw a boundary is something that you're going to do that requires no action from the other person. Does that make sense? So if my kid's watching TV and they're 8 years old and I look at them and I'm like, hey buddy, it's 10 o'clock and we're supposed to be in bed at 9:30. So can you turn that TV off please and go to bed? Is that a boundary? A lot of people, parents in our office are saying, hey, we set a boundary and they just don't respect it. That's not a boundary. That's a request. You literally ask the kid, will you turn the TV off? Now, if I'm 8 or 10 or 15 or 18 and someone asks me something, I'm a human being. I got to ask a question. I can answer it, right? If someone asks me questions, I can answer the question. It's called being a human with a will. And if I'm a 10-year-old kid and someone asks me to turn TV off, I probably don't want to turn it off. And I probably don't have the coping skills and the emotional regulation skills to know how to discipline myself and draw a boundary with myself and say, okay, this isn't worth it right now. And so I do need to go to bed. What 10-year-old naturally knows how to do that? It's a request, and it almost never works. A boundary is, hey guys, it's 9:30. Let me see the control. Yeah, we turn that off. Now, we're going to bed. Do you see what I'm saying? It's not a request. It's a boundary. A boundary requires nothing from the other person. You need to draw those boundaries early and often. Number 2, you need to manage your expectations. And this is a tough one, and I hesitate to really go here because I always want to give you hope, right? I want to give you some hope on the idea that redemption can happen and people can change. But here's the truth. The more the person leans towards like a classic personality disorder, like a narcissistic personality disorder, the less likely it is they're going to change. I know that's tough. Pure narcissist hardly ever change. And if they do change, it requires a tremendous amount of work. So the idea that you're going to set some boundaries and your full-blown narcissist husband is just magically going to have these epiphanies and like, oh, I don't want to make my wife feel so sad. I should change my behavior. That's not how this is going to work. The boundaries are going to protect you. They're going to put you in a position where you're not the victim of this narcissistic injury, but it's not going to change them. And so you need to set realistic expectations. If you have someone that's just struggling with self-centeredness and they have some narcissistic traits, and you over time you set some boundaries, it creates a little chaos in the relationship, which it would. You have some good healthy conversations, they have some epiphanies, some change can happen. But I want you to manage expectations. And you need to know that if you're really dealing with someone that's struggling with strong narcissistic tendencies, the likelihood that they change is not great. You can change, but you can't change people, right? This has special relevance for those of you that have grown up in narcissistic families and you have an older parent who's still a narcissist. They've never really grown out of this. Older brains are more rigid. It's tough for them to see the world differently. It's tough for them to kind of manage their life in a way that they can shift cognitive sets. That's kind of a psychology phrase that I use a lot. That means you just shift the way you think about things. The more rigid your brain is, the harder that is. Think about it. That's why you ever heard that old adage, it's hard to teach old dogs new tricks. It's true. Older people don't learn things as quickly. That's just a neurological reality. If I play memory with my 16-year-old daughter, guess what? I'm losing like every time because she's quicker. Like she learns quicker. Her brain is wired. She's soaking up information. Older people, the older we get, the more rigid it is. Now we have tons of wisdom, and that's awesome, right? Wisdom goes a long way. That general fund of knowledge, you've lived decades. It gives you cognitive shortcuts. You've seen things a million times. You recognize patterns, and so that's great. I'm not knocking kind of the idea that the older we get, the wiser we get. I am saying that the older we get, the tougher it is for us to change. So I'm just planting that in your ear. If you have a narcissistic parent who's now an older adult, the likelihood that they make significant changes in the way they see the world is low. All right. Number 3, avoid emotional reactivity. Avoid emotional reactivity. The idea is narcissists thrive on drama. They love it. It makes them feel powerful, right? We already know from the first session we did last week, they're acting and reacting out of their own insecurity. They don't do what they do because they feel super strong and like, I've got this. And that's not the idea. That's not reality. When you look at them from afar, yeah, of course, they look arrogant and like they think that they've got it all together. The truth is they're feeling inadequate, not enough. They're dealing with their own shame from probably growing up in their own narcissistic family, right? They have their issues. If that's the perspective that they're coming from, you have to recognize that that drama they create is part of what makes them feel safe. It's part of what makes them feel like I'm in control. I can still push the buttons. I can still get what I need from people. I can still kind of assert dominance. I can still feel like the alpha. Your job is to not respond to drama. You cannot be emotionally reactive to a narcissist. It's like pouring gasoline on a fire on some unconscious level. They love it. They love it. So your job is to figure out how to stay just steady. You know what I'm saying? Like you cannot let them see you sweat. When they go into their thing and you need to come, like we said, early and often with the boundaries. And boundaries you've got to set them without emotion. You can't look at someone who's trying to create emotion, they're incredibly emotional, and try to set a boundary in a very emotional way. Shut the bleep up. Here's what you're going to bleep and do. No. Like the minute you go there is the minute they've got you. They've caught you in their narcissistic web. So you've got to maintain stability, emotional regulation. If you don't know how to do that, man, you've got to get with someone that's going to help you do that. And I keep talking about the power of individuals that are going to journey with you in this process. I can't overstate that. You need someone that can help you figure out, like, how do you balance and regulate yourself? We've got a team of people at LiveWell that can help you do that. So if you need to get with a therapist and this kind of sparks something in you, look, call us. We've got you. Go on the coaching platform and get one of our coaches that will just point you towards resources that teach you how to regulate yourself. They'll hold you accountable. They'll ask you how it's going. They understand emotional regulation and can give you strategies and tips that will help you do that. But the idea is you cannot react emotionally to a narcissist. You can't do it. You're literally creating your reality if you do. All right, number 4, you can use the gray rock technique. Have you guys ever heard of this? Gray rock. What does that mean? Well, you ever seen a rock? Not super exciting, are they? Just kind of laying around. Don't have much personality. Just this gray nothing. That flat sort of emotional style where you just aren't movable. You're just like there and you're heavy and that can be literally a anecdote, a kryptonite for a narcissist. Because what are they wanting to do? They're wanting to poke you. They're wanting that reaction. They want to feel powerful. They want to, for you to feel small and for them to feel big. If you're a gray rock, if you're just like in this immovable, boring, flat, reactive person, that literally takes their power from them. So I really cannot overestimate or overemphasize how important it is that you regulate yourself, which leads us to the last sort of bit of encouragement. You've got to get with people. You have to find people that can help you learn how to draw the boundaries and how to stay emotionally kind of solid, how to be the gray rock in the relationship with your narcissist. Change happens within the context of relationships. So whether it's a counselor or a therapist at Live Well, whether it's a coach at Live Well Coaching, whether it's a pastor friend that you have, or just a neighbor that's going to walk with you, somebody's got to step up and put you in a position where you can have that healthy relationship that drives the healthy strategies and the healthy responses. Okay. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to call it right there. I think we could probably do, again, 5 more sessions on this. We're not. We're going to keep going on and keep teaching you some healthy things on Wellness Wednesday. But here's my pledge to you. If you want more information on this, I would encourage you to email us. You can respond to this video in the chat and let us send you some resources, some things that might help you just understand emotional regulation and how to regulate yourself. We'll send you some information on narcissism, and I'll come back to it. At some point in the next few months, I'll revisit narcissism and maybe check in with you guys and see how we can fill in the gaps for how you respond to the narcissist in your life and what the strategies that you can implement look like and how you can apply them in your life in very tangible ways. But for now, we're gonna let that be enough. I thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to do this. Seriously, I love speaking into your life. I love that you take this time to just sit at 12:15 on a Wednesday and watch this. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you need anything. We're looking for everyone to engage on that Live Well coaching platform. So if you have questions or if things have come up as we've had this talk over the last couple of weeks about narcissism, man, go on the Live Well platform and just start commenting, get involved in that community, reach out to a coach. We want you to use the Live Well coaching platform to build that sense of, I'm not alone in this, because you're not. We're with you and we're for you as always. All right. So thank you so much.